Imagine yourself as a passenger on a flight. You are cruising comfortably at thousands of feet. Suddenly, a sound rings out, and the nightmare begins. Just moments ago, everything was perfect. Welcome to some of the most unusual chapters in aviation history. As we explore airplanes breaking apart at cruising altitude, we will uncover how fuel tanks, cargo doors, and metal fatigue caused these tragedies, and how they changed aviation forever. Welcome to Terra Obscura. If you value detailed, serious crash investigations, please like and subscribe. Help us keep these hard lessons from being forgotten. Transworld Airlines Flight 800 was a normal summer night departure that never made it past the shoreline. On July 17, 1996, a Boeing 747 left New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, bound for Paris, with 230 people on board. The evening was warm and clear along Long Island. After a delay on the ground, the jumbo finally took off, climbed out over the South Shore, and turned east over the Atlantic. Inside, people had just settled into their seats. The flight had been airborne for about 12 minutes. Then it vanished. Controllers saw the radar trace climb, then suddenly scatter and disappear. Pilots nearby reported a bright flash low on the horizon, a fireball and burning pieces falling toward the ocean. People on beaches and boats saw the same thing. There was no mayday call, no long dive, just an explosion and wreckage raining down into the sea south of Long Island. Everyone on board died. Rescue turned quickly into recovery. Coast Guard cutters, helicopters, and local boats pulled floating debris and bodies from the water through the night. Over the following months, teams raised wreckage from the seabed and moved it to a hangar, where investigators slowly rebuilt the center of the airplane on a metal frame. That reconstruction became the key to understanding what had happened. The twisted panels told a consistent story. Metal around the middle of the wing box was bent outward, as if something inside had pushed it apart. Soot patterns and tearing pointed back to the large fuel tank in the center of the wing under the cabin floor. On this flight, that tank held only a small amount of fuel. The air conditioning units beneath it had been running for a long time on the ground, heating the structure. Inside the tank, warm fuel and air had created a highly flammable vapor. For years, many people believed the airplane had been hit by a missile or destroyed by a bomb. Investigators examined that idea in detail. They searched for explosive residue and looked at radar and witness accounts. They did not find physical evidence of an external weapon. Instead, all the structural clues pointed to an explosion that started inside the center wing tank itself. The most likely trigger was an electrical short that sent stray voltage into wiring connected to the fuel quantity system inside the tank. A small arc in the vapor space would have been enough to ignite the mixture. The resulting blast ruptured the tank and blew apart the middle of the airplane. The nose separated first and fell away. The rest of the fuselage and the wings broke up moments later as the damaged structure tore itself apart in the air. For the families, the technical explanation could never balance the loss. Many visited the reconstructed wreckage, seeing the outlines of the cabin where their relatives had been sitting. For them, center wing tank explosion was not an engineering term. It was the reason a relative never came home from an ordinary transatlantic flight. For aviation, the crash of Flight 800 changed the way the industry thinks about fuel tanks. Before 1996, designers focused mainly on preventing sparks. Afterward, they accepted that in a large, aging airplane, you cannot guarantee zero ignition sources. So you must also make the fuel environment harder to ignite. Regulators introduced new rules to reduce flammability in tanks, especially those near heat sources. Many jets were fitted with systems that fill empty space above the fuel with nitrogen-rich air, so that any spark finds too little oxygen to cause an explosion. Turkish Airlines Flight 981 was the kind of busy weekend flight that fills up without any effort. On the 3rd of March 1974, a wide-body DC-10 was flying the Istanbul-Paris-London route. The final leg from Paris-Orly to London Heathrow was packed, with many passengers rebooked from an earlier cancelled flight. In total, there were 346 people on board. It was a cold but clear afternoon. The airplane took off from Orly, climbed normally, and turned toward the English Channel. In the cabin, people settled in for the short hop, expecting to be on the ground again in less than an hour. About 10 minutes after takeoff, as the jet was climbing through around 23,000 feet, something went catastrophically wrong in the lower deck. The rear left cargo door suddenly blew outward. That door closed outward rather than inward, and its locking system had known design weaknesses. In this case, the latches were not fully engaged, but the indicators in the cockpit and on the door suggested they were. When the pressure difference between the cabin and the outside air grew strong enough, the partially locked door could not hold. It failed violently, tearing away from the fuselage. The explosive decompression that followed was not limited to the cargo hold. The sudden rush of air downward from the pressurized cabin caused part of the passenger floor above the cargo door to collapse. Sections of the floor and seats were ripped away and sucked out. Several passengers were ejected from the airplane. Even more critically, control cables that ran beneath the cabin floor to the tail and other surfaces were severed or jammed. From that moment on, the crew no longer had full control of the airplane. In the cockpit, the pilots heard a massive bang and felt the aircraft shudder. Warning lights flickered. They quickly put on oxygen masks and tried to understand what had happened. The jet started to pitch down. Control column and pedals no longer gave the expected response. With flight controls damaged, the 3 engines and remaining structure were all they had to work with. The DC-10 entered a steep, accelerating descent. Air traffic control watched the altitude drop rapidly on radar and tried to contact the flight, but there was no time for a calm, structured conversation. The airplane was diving over the French countryside with only a few minutes between the initial failure and the ground. Passengers in the cabin experienced a violent decompression, screaming winds and a rapid nose-down tilt. Oxygen masks were torn around. Some rows near the damaged section were simply gone. At 12:40 local time, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 slammed into the Ermenonville forest, about 40 kilometers northeast of Paris. The impact was almost vertical and at very high speed. The airplane disintegrated. Wreckage was scattered across the trees and muddy clearings. There were no survivors. All 346 people on board were killed, making it at that time the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. Investigators quickly focused on the missing cargo door and the damage pattern in the tail and cabin floor. Evidence showed that the basic failure mechanism was almost identical to a serious incident 2 years earlier. In 1972, an American Airlines DC-10 had lost a cargo door in flight near Windsor, Canada, causing floor collapse and partial loss of control. In that earlier case, the crew had just enough authority left to land the airplane. Investigators had warned that the door design and latching system were unsafe and needed major changes. Those warnings were not fully acted on before Flight 981. On the Turkish Airlines jet, the same basic flaw, an outward opening cargo door with a locking system that could look secure when it was not, combined with rushed ground handling and inadequate inspection. The door blew off, the floor failed, the control cables were severed, and this time there was no recovery. The Ermenonville crash forced the industry to take those earlier warnings seriously. The DC-10's cargo door was redesigned with stronger structure and different locking mechanisms. Inspection and adjustment procedures were tightened. Certification rules for large cargo doors and for the routing and protection of flight control systems were strengthened so that a single failure in the lower fuselage could not so easily destroy all control. Today, when an airliner's cargo doors are closed and latched, there are multiple physical and electrical safeguards behind that simple locked indication. Much of that redundancy exists because a single door on Flight 981 did not hold, a section of floor collapsed, and a fully loaded DC-10 came apart in seconds over a quiet forest north of Paris. United Airlines Flight 811 was a night flight out of Hawaii that turned into a textbook case of what happens when a door fails in midair. On the 24th of February 1989, a Boeing 747 was scheduled to fly from Honolulu to Auckland and then on to Sydney. The airplane had already arrived from the mainland. Now, just before midnight, it was full of passengers heading to the South Pacific. There were 337 people on board, 328 passengers and 9 crew. It was dark over the Pacific, with only scattered lights on the ground and a black ocean below. The jet took off from Honolulu, climbed out over the water, and turned south. In the cabin, people settled under blankets, dimmed their reading lights, and prepared to sleep through the long night. Outside, the airplane climbed through the mid-20,000-foot range. Engine steady, lights flashing on the wingtips. Then the forward right cargo door failed. Without warning, the door blew outward and tore away from the side of the fuselage. The decompression was explosive. A section of the passenger cabin floor above the door collapsed, and a huge hole opened in the right side of the fuselage near the front economy section. Seats, insulation, and interior panels were ripped out. 9 passengers sitting in that area were pulled out of the airplane and lost to the night sky. Inside, those further back and forward heard a massive bang and felt the cabin lurch. Oxygen masks dropped. Wind and debris roared through the hole. The lights flickered. People who were still strapped in clung to their armrests and tried to breathe through the masks. Luggage and loose objects flew through the cabin toward the opening. In the cockpit, the crew heard the explosion, felt the shock, and saw warnings light up. The airplane yawed and rolled as the structure on the right side was damaged. Pieces of metal from the failed door and fuselage had flown back and struck the right engines and wing. One engine lost thrust and had to be shut down. Another was damaged. The pilots quickly donned their oxygen masks, began an emergency descent to a lower, breathable altitude, and turned back toward Honolulu. For the next several minutes, they fought to keep control of a badly wounded airplane. The forward section was open to the night with edges of torn metal and flapping insulation. The pressure hull was compromised. 2 engines were out or degraded, yet the basic structure of the wing and tail was still intact, and the remaining systems responded. The crew stabilized the descent, talked briefly with air traffic control, and lined up for an emergency landing back at Honolulu. Approach and landing were tense. The jet was heavy with fuel and damaged. The pilots kept their speed up to maintain control authority and flew a straight straight-in approach. Passengers near the windows could see emergency vehicles and flashing lights waiting along the runway. Despite the noise and damage, the 747 touched down on the runway, rolled out, and came to a stop surrounded by fire trucks. As soon as the airplane stopped, the crew ordered an evacuation. Slides were deployed, and passengers poured out onto the runway. Many were barefoot or in socks. Some were bleeding or in shock. They ran away from the aircraft and gathered under the guidance of airport staff and firefighters. Only later did most of them learn that 9 people seated near the hole in the fuselage had been lost in flight and could not be recovered. The investigation focused quickly on the cargo door. This was not the first time a wide-body jet had lost an outward opening cargo door. Earlier incidents, including a serious case on another airline, had already raised concerns about the design. On Flight 811, evidence showed that the locking mechanism had not fully engaged, even though indicators suggested the door was secure. Electrical problems in the door system could have driven the latching motor in the wrong direction, overcoming the safety features and leaving the door vulnerable to pressure loads in flight. Investigators and regulators concluded that the combination of design issues and maintenance practices had allowed a dangerous condition to persist. The National Transportation Safety Board called for major changes to the door's design and its locking system, as well as stricter inspection and modification programs on similar airplanes. Aloha Airlines Flight 243 was a routine island hop that turned into one of the most famous missing roof stories in aviation. On April 28, 1988, a Boeing 737 was flying a short inter-island route in Hawaii. The airplane had already made several legs that day. Now it was flying from Hilo toward Honolulu, with a stop at Kahului on Maui. The weather was good. Most people on board were locals and regular island travelers. It felt like a commuter bus with wings. After takeoff from Hilo, the jet climbed to cruising altitude around 24,000 feet. Cabin service started. Passengers loosened their belts, talked across the aisle, and looked out at the Pacific and the scattered clouds below. It was a normal, smooth cruise. Then, without warning, the top of the airplane opened to the sky. There was a sudden explosive noise and a blast of air. A large section of the upper fuselage, from just behind the cockpit to the area over the forward part of the wing, tore away. In an instant, the cabin went from a closed tube to something like a giant convertible. Blue sky replaced the ceiling. Insulation and pieces of metal flew backward in the slipstream. The decompression was violent. A flight attendant who had been standing near the front rows was swept out of the airplane and lost. Seats and floor structure flexed. Oxygen masks dropped. Passengers who were not strapped in were thrown around. Papers, cushions, and debris were being pulled toward the open side and up into the air. In the cockpit, the pilots were hit by the same shock and noise. The instrument panel remained in front of them, but panels above and behind were damaged. The control column still worked. Despite the massive structural failure, the wings and tail were still attached, and the main control surfaces still responded. The crew quickly donned their oxygen masks, reduced power, and began an emergency descent to get the airplane down to a breathable altitude. The 737 was now flying with a huge hole in the top of the fuselage, tearing at the edges in the high-speed airflow. Passengers could see the island below directly through the gap. Many held on to armrests and seat frames, trying to stay low and keep their masks on. Cabin crew who were still inside crawled and moved from seat to seat, checking on people, shouting simple instructions, and trying to calm those who were in shock. The pilots turned toward Kahului Airport on Maui, the nearest suitable runway. They declared an emergency and lined up for a straight-in approach. The airplane was difficult to handle because of the disturbed airflow and damaged structure, but it was still flyable. As they descended, the view from the ground showed a small jet with much of its upper forward fuselage missing, yet still on a controlled path toward the runway. The landing was firm but successful. The 737 touched down, rolled out, and came to a stop on the runway. Emergency vehicles rushed up. Passengers evacuated down the slides and out through doors that still worked, stepping onto Hawaiian concrete with pieces of insulation in their hair and open sky where the roof of the cabin should have been. Apart from the one flight attendant who had been ejected during the initial failure, everyone survived. The images that followed went around the world. Photos showed a Boeing 737 sitting on the ramp in sunlight, with its forward cabin roof simply gone. Rows of seats were visible from the outside, like a cutaway model. For many people, it was the first time they had seen an airliner survive such dramatic structural loss. The investigation focused on why the fuselage had failed so completely in midair. Flight 243 was an older airplane that had flown tens of thousands of short cycles in a warm, salty marine environment. Each cycle meant pressurizing and depressurizing the cabin. Over years, small cracks had formed in the lap joints where the fuselage skin panels overlapped. Corrosion and a particular bonding method used in that generation of 737s allowed many tiny cracks to grow together until a large section of the skin could no longer handle the stress. On that flight, the weakened area finally let go. The accident turned Aloha 243 into the signature case for aging aircraft problems. Regulators and manufacturers tightened inspection rules for older high-cycle jets, especially those flying short routes in harsh environments. New methods such as detailed non-destructive testing and more aggressive inspection schedules were required for lap joints and other critical areas. Airlines were pushed to retire or heavily reinforce airframes that had reached very high cycle counts. Pan Am Flight 103 was supposed to be an ordinary evening Atlantic crossing a few days before Christmas. On 21 December 1988, a Pan Am Boeing 747 was flying from London to New York, the transatlantic leg of a route that had started in Frankfurt. On board were 259 people, students heading home for the holidays, business travelers, families, and crew who knew the route well. It was dark over Britain, with the lights of small towns shining through gaps in the cloud. The airplane climbed out of Heathrow and leveled at cruise, heading northwest toward the Atlantic. About half an hour after takeoff, while Flight 103 was passing over southern Scotland at around 31,000 feet, everything changed in an instant. People on the ground near the town of Lockerbie heard a deep boom from the sky. Some saw a flash, and then burning pieces falling out of the clouds. On radar screens, the symbol that had been moving smoothly across Scotland suddenly broke apart and vanished. There was no mayday call, no report of trouble from the cockpit. Whatever had happened was immediate and catastrophic. High in the night sky, a bomb in the forward cargo hold had detonated. The device had been hidden inside a suitcase and loaded into a luggage container in the lower deck, just behind the nose. When it exploded, the blast punched a hole in the left side of the forward fuselage just below the cabin floor. The pressure difference between the inside of the pressurized cabin and the thin air outside did the rest. The front of the airplane, including the cockpit and a section of the upper deck, tore away from the rest of the fuselage. The remaining structure, badly weakened, broke into several large sections. Wings, engines, and tail separated as they fell. Wreckage rained down over a wide area. The forward section of the fuselage fell near a field. A large part of the wing and fuel tanks came down on the houses of Sherwood Crescent in Lockerbie, causing a massive explosion and fire that destroyed several homes and killed 11 people on the ground. Other sections of the cabin and tail landed in fields and on the edges of the town. Debris, luggage, and personal items were scattered across the countryside. Rescue workers arriving in Lockerbie faced the combined scene of an air disaster and a local catastrophe. Burning houses, shattered streets, and pieces of an airliner spread among them. There were no survivors from the airplane. All 259 people on board were killed, along with the 11 residents on the ground. From the start, investigators suspected an explosion rather than a simple structural failure. The wreckage pattern was consistent with a breakup beginning in the forward fuselage, not a normal in-flight breakup from turbulence or metal fatigue. When teams began recovering and examining pieces of the skin and floor around the cargo hold, they found telltale signs of a blast. Metal bent outward, scorching, and a distinct pattern of small punctures. Eventually, they identified fragments of a suitcase, a luggage container, and parts of an electronic device that showed traces of high explosive. The bomb had been hidden inside a portable cassette player, then placed in a suitcase and checked in as luggage. That suitcase was routed through other airports and flights before ending up in the cargo hold of Pan Am 103. Security gaps and loose baggage handling practices at the time allowed a bag without a matching boarded passenger to travel on a transatlantic flight. In the years that followed, the technical investigation and criminal inquiries traced the path of the bomb and the people believed to have planned and carried out the attack. There were trials, sanctions, and long-running political disputes. For the families spread across the United States, Britain, and other countries, those processes moved slowly compared to the speed with which they had lost children, parents, and friends on a winter evening. Alaska Airlines Flight 261 was a routine winter flight that turned into a slow mechanical failure over the Pacific. On January 31, 2000, the McDonnell Douglas twinjet was scheduled to fly from Puerto Vallarta in Mexico to San Francisco, and then on to Seattle. The accident leg was the Puerto Vallarta to San Francisco sector. On board were 88 people, 83 passengers, and 5 crew. Many were on their way home from vacations, still in casual clothes, sunburned and relaxed. The weather along the California coast was good, with clear skies and calm seas. The airplane climbed out over the Pacific and leveled off at cruising height. From the cabin, everything felt normal. Drinks and snacks were served. People read, slept, or looked out at the fading coastline. In the cockpit, though, the crew were already dealing with a problem. The flight had been held on the ground earlier that day because of difficulty with the pitch trim system, which moves the horizontal stabilizer on the tail. Mechanics had checked it and released the airplane. Now, in cruise, the same issue came back. The trim did not feel right. The controls were heavy in pitch. The pilots told air traffic control that they had a jammed or restricted stabilizer and asked for a lower altitude to reduce the loads on the tail. Inside the tail, was the key part in this story: the jack screw. It is a long threaded rod that runs through a matching nut, moving the horizontal stabilizer up or down when rotated. Over time, the threads on the nut wear and need lubrication and careful inspection. On this airplane, that maintenance had not been done often enough. Procedures and intervals at the airline had been stretched beyond what the design could safely tolerate. By the day of Flight 261, the threads in the nut were badly worn. As the flight continued along the coast, the wear reached its final stage. The last usable threads stripped away, and the nut could no longer hold the jack screw. In simple terms, the tailplane support failed. The horizontal stabilizer was free to move under aerodynamic forces rather than under controlled trim commands. In the cockpit, the crew suddenly felt the nose want to drop. The airplane pitched down into a dive. They fought back with their control columns and with engine thrust, pulling and adding power to bring the nose up. For a time, they managed to regain some control by carefully balancing elevator forces and thrust settings. They told controllers they had lost primary control of the stabilizer and were working the problem. Cockpit voice recordings later showed calm but intense work. The captain and first officer discussed what they were feeling in the controls, which checklists to run, and how to keep the airplane level. They asked for vectors and lower altitudes. At one point, they considered trying to land at Los Angeles or another nearby airport if they could keep the jet flyable. But the tail damage was too severe. After a brief period where they had partial control, the stabilizer shifted again. The airplane pitched nose down more violently. In a last attempt to keep the nose from dropping, the pilots pulled hard and used engine power, but the forces on the tail grew beyond what the structure could take. The jet entered a steep nose-down dive off the California coast. At one point, it rolled inverted. Passengers felt themselves pushed out of their seats. Anything not strapped down flew around the cabin. The structural loads in this dive were extreme. The airplane descended at high speed toward the ocean. In the final seconds, parts of the tail and control surfaces failed under stress. Flight 261 slammed into the water nose first, off the coast near Point Mugu. The impact destroyed the aircraft completely. There were no survivors. The investigation recovered pieces of the jack screw and the mating nut from the wreckage on the seabed. Under the microscope, the threads were almost completely worn away. Investigators also pulled maintenance records, lubrication schedules, and prior reports of trim problems. They found that inspection and lubrication intervals for the jack screw had been extended, that warning signs in earlier checks were not properly acted upon, and that the safety margin on that critical part had been quietly eroded over time. Alaska Airlines Flight 261 became the reference case for what can happen when a single piece of hardware, buried inside the tail, is allowed to wear beyond its limits. It was not caused by bad weather or pilot error in the usual sense. The crew were widely praised for their efforts to keep the airplane controllable as long as they did. The root cause lay in maintenance practices, oversight, and the assumptions that had been made about how long a vital component could safely remain in service. After the crash, regulators and manufacturers rewrote rules for jack screw systems and other critical moving parts. Lubrication and inspection intervals were tightened. Detailed procedures were introduced for measuring wear, not just for looking at parts with the naked eye. Airlines were told in clear terms that extending maintenance tasks for convenience or cost reasons on such components could not be accepted. In a video about airplanes that break up or fail in midair, Alaska Airlines Flight 261 is the chapter where there is no bomb, no missile, and no obvious external damage. There is only the long, invisible story of one threaded rod and nut in the tail, slowly wearing down from thousands of cycles, until one evening over the Pacific, the last metal gives way, and an entire airplane follows it into the sea. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was a routine domestic hop that turned into the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. On 12 August 1985, a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 was scheduled to fly from Tokyo to Osaka. It was a busy summer evening, right in the middle of the holiday period. On board were 524 people, business travelers, families returning home, children excited to sit near the windows. The route was short, less than an hour. Many passengers probably did not even think of it as a real flight. Just a quick ride between two big cities. The jumbo left Tokyo's Haneda Airport in the early evening and climbed out over the bay, then turned toward the mountains of central Japan. At first, everything seemed normal. The cabin crew started a fast service. People loosened seatbelts and looked out at the fading light over the hills. Then, about 12 minutes after takeoff, a loud bang shook the airplane. Passengers heard a deep thump, almost like an explosion, and felt the cabin shudder. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. In the cockpit, warning lights flashed and a rapid decompression alarm sounded. The airplane had just suffered a major structural failure in the tail. The rear pressure bulkhead, a large curved wall that closes the back of the pressurized cabin, had burst open. That bulkhead was not just a wall. It sat directly in front of the vertical tail and the hydraulic systems that controlled the airplane. Years earlier, the same 747 had a tail strike accident. The bulkhead had been repaired, but the repair had not been done correctly. A critical joint was patched with the wrong structure. Over thousands of flights, a hidden crack grew in that area until, on this flight, it finally tore across the metal under pressure. When the bulkhead failed, high-pressure air from the cabin rushed into the tail. The blast ripped off a large portion of the vertical stabilizer and damaged all 4 hydraulic systems. Hydraulic fluid poured out into the airflow and was lost. Within seconds, the airplane could no longer move its main control surfaces in a normal way. The yoke and pedals still moved, but the control surfaces at the tail and wings were no longer responding. Passengers near the rear saw pieces of structure and insulation flying past their windows. Some described part of the tail missing. The airplane began to wander in the sky, rolling and pitching in slow, uncomfortable motions. It was still flying, but it was badly wounded. In the cockpit, the crew knew they had a serious problem. They put on oxygen masks, declared an emergency, and tried to turn back toward Tokyo. Very quickly, they realized that normal control inputs were not working. The 747 started to enter a strange cycle. Nose up, slow climb, then nose down, and a dive, then a pull-up again. With no hydraulic pressure, the pilots began trying to control the airplane using only engine thrust and whatever little response was left in the damaged structure. For the next half hour, Flight 123 stayed in the air in what was essentially a barely controlled drift over the mountains. Radar tracks showed the airplane tracing large, looping turns and climbing and descending repeatedly. Inside, passengers were thrown around as the jet pitched and rolled. Some wrote farewell notes on air sickness bags and scraps of paper. Others prayed or held hands. A few of those notes were later found in the wreckage. On the ground, controllers and military radar operators watched the strange path. Fighter jets were scrambled to try to get a visual on the crippled 747, but by the time they reached the area, the situation in the cockpit was getting worse. The crew were exhausted from fighting the airplane. The damage to the tail and controls was simply too great. Eventually, the loops tightened and the altitude swings grew more extreme. The jet descended toward a remote forested mountain ridge. In the last minutes, the airplane entered a final uncontrolled dive. The crew pulled with everything they had, and the engines roared at high power, but there was not enough control left. The nose came up slightly, the wings struck trees on a ridge, and then the airplane slammed into the mountainside. The impact destroyed most of the 747. Wreckage was scattered through dense forest on a steep slope. Rescue teams faced a long, difficult climb into the crash site. When they finally reached it, they found that almost everyone had died on impact. Out of 524 people on board, only 4 survived. A young girl, a woman, and 2 other passengers seated near the rear of the cabin in a small pocket where the structure had remained just intact enough. For Japan, the crash was a national trauma. Many of the victims were well known or came from the same companies and communities. News coverage showed the wreckage on the mountainside and the faces of grieving families. The fact that the airplane had stayed in the air for more than 30 minutes after the initial failure, with passengers writing last messages, made the story even more painful. The investigation uncovered the root cause: the incorrect repair to the rear pressure bulkhead after the old tail strike accident years before. Instead of following the manufacturer's full repair plan, the team that did the work had used a simpler joint that left a hidden weak spot. That weak spot slowly cracked under the repeated stress of pressurization cycles until it finally failed. When the bulkhead blew out on Flight 123, it sent a shockwave through the tail, ripped open the structure, and took away the hydraulics that the pilots needed to control the airplane. The crew's efforts to keep the jet flying with engines alone were remarkable, but the damage was beyond what any pilot could overcome. On July 17, 2014, a Boeing 777 left Amsterdam for Kuala Lumpur with 298 people on board, 283 passengers, and 15 crew. Most were Dutch citizens, along with travelers from Malaysia, Australia, and several other countries. It was a summer afternoon in Europe. The jet taxied out of Schiphol Airport, took off, and climbed east on a busy airway that crossed Germany, Poland, and then Ukraine on the way toward Asia. At that time, eastern Ukraine was not a normal piece of sky. Fighting on the ground had been going on for months between Ukrainian government forces and armed groups. Several military aircraft had already been shot down at lower altitudes. Authorities had closed the airspace below a certain height, and airliners were routed above it. Many airlines were still using those routes because they were shorter and saved fuel, and at normal cruising height they were believed to be out of reach of most weapons used in the conflict. Flight 17 leveled off at about 33,000 feet and settled into cruise. In the cabin, passengers relaxed for the long journey. Families with children watched the clouds. A large group of people heading to an international AIDS conference talked quietly or dozed. The mood on board was the usual mixture of boredom and quiet anticipation at the start of a very long flight. In the cockpit, the crew worked through routine tasks. The weather was good. Air traffic control handed them from one sector to the next as the airplane crossed borders. Over eastern Ukraine, the jet followed a standard airway, just like many other flights that day, far above the patchwork of fields, villages, and roads below. Then, somewhere near the town of Hrubov, everything ended in a few seconds. To people on the ground, the first sign was a loud bang in the sky and a flash near a high white contrail. Some saw a streak headed upward, then an explosion, then a large cloud of smoke and burning debris falling. Other crews in the area saw a sudden bright bloom in the distance where Flight 17 should have been. On radar screens, the target that had been moving smoothly across eastern Ukraine simply broke up and disappeared. There was no distress call, no request for a descent. Whatever happened was too sudden for the pilots to say anything. The airplane broke apart in the air. A warhead had detonated close to the left side of the cockpit and forward fuselage. High-speed fragments tore through the nose and the front of the cabin. The front of the jet separated, and the rest of the fuselage, wings, and engines were fatally damaged. Large pieces fell out of the sky, some still burning, spreading wreckage over fields for kilometers. Smaller fragments rained down over a wide area, mixed with baggage, seats, and parts of the cabin interior. On the ground, farmers and villagers soon realized that pieces of an airliner were falling around them. Wreckage smashed into fields, gardens, and roads. One large section of fuselage came down near Hrubov. Another section of the cabin and the center wing area hid elsewhere. There were no survivors. The force of the breakup and the fall from cruising height meant that everyone on board died in the air or on impact. Over time, international teams gained access and began the slow process of recovery. Bodies were taken out of the fields, identified, and returned to families. Wreckage was tagged, and some key pieces were transported to the Netherlands. As with TWA Flight 800 years earlier, investigators recreated sections of the aircraft in a hangar, focusing on the forward fuselage and cockpit where most of the damage had begun. The pattern of holes and tearing around the nose told a clear story. Hundreds of small bow-tie-shaped and cube-shaped fragments had penetrated the skin from the outside, all from roughly the same direction. The cockpit area had been peppered with high-energy fragments. The left side window frames and panels were heavily damaged and bent inward. This was not what a simple in-flight fire or structural failure looked like. It was the signature of a weapon that had exploded just outside the airplane. The investigation concluded that Flight 17 had been brought down by a surface-to-air missile from a type known as Buk, part of a medium-range air defense system designed to shoot down high-flying aircraft. The warhead detonated near the front of the jet, shredding the cockpit and forward cabin. There is something especially unsettling about an airplane that does not simply descend, but comes apart in the sky itself. Not a long glide, not a controlled emergency approach, but a sudden break, a missing door, a torn roof, a shattered tail, wreckage scattered over fields, towns, and oceans. In this documentary, we have stayed inside that specific kind of nightmare. We saw fuel tanks that turned into pressure bombs under the cabin floor, old repairs hidden in the tail that finally gave way, cargo doors that never truly locked, skin panels that cracked after thousands of short flights, and devices placed in luggage holds that turned a full airliner into fragments in a matter of seconds. The flights were different. The years and places were different. But the pattern was the same. A structure pushed just past its limit, and almost no time for anyone on board to understand what was happening. For investigators, these accidents were not puzzles solved in days. They were years of work, divers bringing up fragments from the seabed, teams walking through forests and farmland collecting scraps of skin and wiring, Technicians rebuilding sections of fuselage in huge hangars, piece by numbered piece, until the shape of a cabin or a cockpit appeared again in twisted metal. From the outside, it can look cold, but that work is the only way to turn raw loss into concrete lessons. Those lessons changed a lot more than the airplanes you see here. Fuel tanks are no longer treated as simple metal boxes. Their vapors are managed, their wiring is shielded, their empty space is often filled with inert gas, so a stray spark has nothing to ignite. Cargo doors and floor structures are built with multiple layers of mechanical protection so that one misrigged latch cannot take away all control cables at once. Aging airframes flying short, frequent routes are inspected with methods that can see tiny cracks long before they become a missing panel or a torn roof. The way we think about repairs is different. A tail strike or heavy landing does not just earn a line in a logbook. It triggers detailed repair plans that must be followed exactly, then checked and rechecked over the life of the airplane. A shortcut taken in a hangar today can show up again years later at cruise altitude, and the industry learned that the hard way. Security and routing changed as well. Suitcases are not just weighed and tagged, they are scanned, traced, and matched to named passengers. Routes over conflict zones are no longer planned only by altitude, but by asking a harder question. What kind of weapons are down there? And what can they reach? The sky above a war is no longer treated as an empty corridor. For the families of the people on these flights, none of this is an answer in the emotional sense. They lost someone on an ordinary day, on an ordinary ticket, and no technical report can make that feel just. What it can do is make sure that the same failure does not quietly repeat itself for another set of strangers. If there is one theme that runs through all of these stories, it is that nothing on an airliner is truly minor. A patch in the tail, a piece of wiring in a tank, a latch on a door, a suitcase that is not properly checked, a crack in a joint you cannot see with the naked eye. Each one looks small until the moment it meets high altitude, pressure, and speed. Then it is the only thing that matters. Modern aviation is far safer now than it was when most of these accidents happened. Tens of thousands of flights take off and land every day without incident. Part of that safety is the quiet result of disasters like these. Every time a mechanic rejects a bad repair, every time a dispatcher routes around a risky area, every time a security agent pulls one suspicious bag off a flight, they are acting in the shadow of these mid-air breakups. If you have stayed with this story to the end, you are part of a small group of viewers who want more than a few shocking clips. You want to know what really happened, why it happened, and what changed afterward. That kind of attention is what keeps serious, long-form aviation documentaries alive. If you want to see more calm, detailed investigations like this, you can help in a very simple way. Like this video, subscribe to Terra Obscura, and share it with someone who cares about aviation history and safety. It tells the platform that you value real stories from the sky, told without shortcuts, and it helps make sure that the hard lessons written in wreckage and reports are not forgotten the next time a